Had a good networking break. It's not the last one, so you can safely take your seats and know that you'll have time to talk to folks again. And I do want to thank again the Canadian Canola Growers Association before we start this session for sponsoring this next fireside chat with our able moderator, Claire Citeau, who you met earlier, who is moderating a discussion between Dominic, Barton, and Mairead, Lavery. Dominic Barton is the chairman of Rio Tinto and spent over 30 years at McKinsey & Company, including 9 years as a global managing partner from 2009 to 2018. He also held positions, including most notably as Canada's ambassador to China and previously as chair of Canada's Advisory Council for Economic Growth. In the middle on the stage here, Mairead Lavery was appointed president and CEO of the EDC in February 2019. Also holds positions including as board chair for the EDC subsidiary FinDev Canada and as a board member of Ontario Global 100. Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much. I thought I was going to do the introductions, but you've just done it for me. Thank you for saving that. All right, we'll just get going with this conversation here today. And my first question will be for you, Mairead. EDC Export Development Canada has released its vision for 2030. And when I looked on your website, I saw your cover letter and I quote that this vision is that Canada be recognized as a leader in international trade. In your message specifically, by 2030, Canada has regained its standing as a leader in international trade, building a better and stronger economic future for all Canadians. Have we lost ground that we need to regain? And if so, what happened? Is Canada punching below its weight?
Well, thank you, Claire, and thank you to all the organizations for the invite today. It's a pleasure to be with you. So, straight answer, yes, we have lost ground. Excuse me. We are definitely punching below our weight, which is not necessarily the best way to start this conversation. But if you take a look at our trade statistics between 1996 and 2000, we had 4% market share of global exports, 4% market share. Today, in 2021, that number is 2.3%. So you just have to take a look at the statistics that tell you, yes, we are not punching at our weight. And in fact, we're at the bottom of our OECD peers. So it's a pretty dire place to be. And there are a few reasons for that. Primarily, as much as I would like to say Canada is a very diversified exporter, we just heard Goldie talk about it, you know, about the propensity we have to export to the South. And certainly our largest trading partner continues to be the US. But if you look a little bit deeper, 90% of our exports go to advanced economies today. So 90% of Canadian exports to advanced economies. And as much as we are part of that advanced economy network, think about it. These are countries where the population is growing older, where the consumption patterns are slowing down, and where there is low economic growth. So all of our trading partners are the slowest countries in the world for growth. So it's no surprise that we're actually losing market share. Of course, we have to recognize the emergence of new players since those statistics came to the table, including primarily China, which, you know, absorbs such a share of global exports today. But fundamentally, we have not shifted as Canada to embrace, which is the positive side of the story, emerging markets, developing markets, the markets where you see population growth, where you see the growth of middle consumers, where you see a very different behavior pattern in terms of population growth, demographics, middle class, urbanization, many of those themes that actually will say they are the consumers of the future. So yes, that's where we need to really shift the dialogue in Canada to do something that recognizes we have a trade problem and that sets out a vision for how we can fix that trade problem over the next number of years. So one word, ambition is what we need in Canada. Maybe a second one, diversification.
Ambition, diversification. Thank you for that. My next question is to both of you now. In 2017, the federal budget referenced the Barton report and the target of Canada growing its agri-food exports from $55 billion in 2015 to 75 billion in 2025. Here we are in the first few weeks of 2023, and I was asked this very question before a Parliament committee recently. We can happily say we have hit that target, even surpassed it before time. However, our research suggests that much of that increase in exports is largely due to an increase in the value of our exports, perhaps less so when it comes to volume. And if you look at the global context over the same period of time, while our broad numbers appear to have gone up, our major competitors, Brazil, the EU, China, have increased their market share. Ours seem to be stagnant and declining if we look at the past 15, 20 years. We used to be the second exporter of egg and food products in the world. We're now the fifth exporter. So my question to you is, are we measuring the right thing? How do we measure our progress when it comes to our place in the world? Do we need to set new ambitious targets and find better ways of measuring our progress in the world? Dominic, perhaps you want to get us
started? It's wonderful to be here, by the way. The ag industry is an industry that gives me energy. So it's I love being back and connecting with it. On your question, I was actually looking back through some of the recommendations in the report, and you're right. You know, on the one hand, good news is we've surpassed that 75 billion. By the way, the ag table that was subsequent to us raised it even then, and I think even there we're either close to hitting that number or not. And it is very much from price, not volume. But we also had in those recommendations, it wasn't just the revenues, it was market share. That there were market share targets that were in there, and exactly as you've been saying, we've actually been going the other way, and that's the worry. So I think in terms of our measures, we need to have several of them. I think there's the actual revenues that we're seeing, and I do think we need to raise that given the context. The world's different. We've had a lot of shocks in the last few years, so there's no way we can come back to that. I haven't done the analysis, but on your ambition point, I think we should look at that in terms of market share, and so then we need the market share. And we had just on it, let's say, increase Canada's share of global ag exports to 8% from 5.7% to be number 2 after the U.S. The U.S. is the lead, that was ag exports. On ag food, and I know we always get confused, it was to go from 2.8% market share to 5.6%. So to go from 11th up to it would be 4th. I always look at Holland that's there, that they drive me crazy because you couldn't fit them in a sort of the greater Toronto area, and they, excuse my language, they kick our ass. They're way more productive, they're driven. And I remember when we had conversations, I did a trip to actually talk to them, and I said, look out, because we're coming. And they said, we're already one step, we're already moving this way. And so there's this kind of collective ambition that's there. So again, I think we need value, and we need the market share, but I think there's a missing target that we also didn't have in the report that I feel strongly about, which is the number of ag companies, however you want to define them, that are in the top 25 in the world. And I don't think we have one. And you can't be a dominant player if you don't have companies of that size. And what I look at is what Brazil has done in the last 10 years in terms of the significance of their companies. The U.S. has always had that. Germany, France. So we have to, I think there's at least a dimension of the scale of the organizations that we have. If you're going to be a global player, you've got to have scale, and we've lost that over time. So those would be the 3 things I would look for.
Mairead?
Yeah, so I'm totally with Dominic around the whole value discussion, and certainly setting ambitious targets. The fact that I think we take much too simplified a perspective on this as well. So we were fortunate that those targets existed and that people monitor against them, because what gets measured gets done is, absolutely true, but it's not specific enough. And I think that what we have to start doing is talk about subsectors and talk about geographies very differently. Indo-Pacific is not just, of course, we refer to it as a region, but there are very different countries with very different needs for very different products. And I think when we talk about measurement, we've got to start breaking down the targets and start to look at where Canada can truly lead and make a difference. So is it commodities? Is it aquaculture? Is it value-added processing? Like, we've got to get to that level, and that's, Claire, where I see organizations such as yours can be really helpful, because I think when you have such a big, ambitious goal, if you don't break it down, then no one's actually going to help deliver the components of that goal. So I would absolutely say break it down. It's got to be value driven. I totally agree with Dominic as well around the need for global champions. And even more than that, we actually need to celebrate our global champions in Canada. That's what we don't do. We have a very Canadian attitude which actually despises our global champions and really would like to see them in some instances fail rather than be successful. And we don't recognize how they can actually bring medium and small size companies into their supply chain locally, get them used and exposed to what exporting might mean, and supplying, global centers such that they then can actually do the exporting themselves. So I think we think very specific versus the fact that it is a value chain in Canada, and we've got to encourage all the players in the value chain to actually help deliver it. I do think, Dominic, one of the areas we might have some global champions is in fertilizer. That's probably the one where we might find a global champion, but other than that, I totally agree with you.
Thank you. I think you've started answering part of the next question as well. For many in the ag and food sector, really the Barton report was groundbreaking, and I think we continue to hear about it. It really recognized that Canada's ag and food sector should be front and center when it comes to being an economic driver of growth, but jobs as well in this country. So really exciting and setting a bold and overarching aspiration to develop the ag and food sector. When you look at the next 10, 15 years down the road, fast forward, what is your vision? What would be your vision statement for the sector 15 years from now? And what would be the top 4 or 5 policies or key actions to get us there? And perhaps, Mairead, that question for you is, where would agriculture specifically fit in that picture?
So let's start. You know that I don't usually talk policy because it's not my remit. That's the government's remit on policy. But I think we have to, and we've just heard this morning with 2 panels about the need for Canadian agriculture. I mean, the demand is there, the need is there. I think we've spent a long time as Canada talking about our natural resource-based industries, and in fact have gone through a love-hate relationship with them around, we have all these natural resources, but in fact we need to move to these different type of industries to then today to actually come back to the point following like the illegal invasion of Ukraine, we're back to these actual natural resources, or with electrification where we need critical minerals, understanding that our natural resources are still a success factor and a competitive advantage for Canada. So for me, the 10-year vision and where we need to get to is to understand that our natural resources are something that we actually can use to take Canada into a leading position and to increase our trade. And I think ag is incredibly one of those really important sectors. And as people move to a security conversation, that becomes even more prominent. On the policy front, I don't come at it from policy. As I said, it's not my job. But where I do come at it is, what are the challenges that the exporters are facing that therefore demand different actions or different policies? And number one, and we've heard it this morning, is trade enabling infrastructure. It is absolutely our West Coast port, which is not able to deal with the capacity. So it starts there, but it also goes into our rail system, it goes into our road network, and it goes into what we haven't heard this morning, 5G. It goes into digital infrastructure, because the way forward and dealing with the imperative climate action, we have got to get more productivity in this sector. We've got to get more automation, and we've actually got to adopt new methods and new ways of bringing agriculture and food processing to the world. And that is going to look like artificial intelligence, data mining, machine learning, and as I said, automation. For that, we need a 5G infrastructure, and we need it across all of Canada, not just in our cities. So there's incredibly important barriers that must be overcome to actually enable us to get ag to the rest of the world.
I think many farmers across Canada and rural communities will certainly agree with that. Same question, what's your vision for the sector 15 years down the road?
Totally agree with what you're saying, and building off that. I mean, I think we should, again, back to the ambition, and I love what you're saying about breaking it down, but I think we should be, I'm thinking 2035, we should be a top 3 player. It's just it's required. We're moving our global population to 10 billion people. We've got food security, supply chain issues, which I think will continue because of the geopolitics that are going on. It's even more critical than it was before. So that will really unlock a lot of growth in this country. So I think I would focus on the sort of the vision being number 3, and then I would go to a brand, the brand. And this is something that makes me a bit crazy. And I don't want to, if you don't mind, just a small story. When I was in China, I was invited to the owner of SKP, which is a company in Beijing, and they have that runs malls, like shopping malls, but these are high-end malls. So this mall its annual revenues were $12 billion a year. So this is not, you think about the scale, he has 2 of them. So I go there, I went with a friend, so he didn't know the Canadian ambassador was coming. I showed up, and then his friend introduced me. I said, "Oh, you're Canadian ambassador." He goes, "Let me take you to my food store." And it's like a high-end food store. So I go in there, and there's a stand-up picture of Macaulay, Minister Macaulay, right, in a cutout. And so this wasn't set up, is what I'm saying. So I come in there, and he's got these chilled pork, right, Canadian chilled pork. This is just before the National Day, and it's extremely high priced, but it's from Canada, which is rare because of all the blockages and all of this stuff. But he's selling that. And then we go, and I'm sitting there just going, and he said to me, he goes, "You guys can't brand yourself out of a paper bag." And so I said, okay, whatever. So I go down the alleyway, and there's canola, the oil. But what he's done is put like Canada geese on them, and he spelled them wrong, right? It's like Canada geek, okay? And I remember when, you spelled that wrong. He goes, "At least I'm branding your product, okay? I brand it because it's Canadian. I can sell it for more because it's Canadian." And this is a guy, I don't know him. He's amazing. And this is where I just sit there, and he literally was almost like shaking his head at me going, "I mean, what's the matter with you guys on that?" And that's where we've talked about this for a long time. I mean, Chris Ford, he's been pushing on this as well. And I think we've got, New Zealand has a brand. It has a brand that covers many of the different products. It has a brand, it's quality, it's sustainable, it's healthy. There's our regulatory standards come in. So it's something that I just want to, I think we should be number 3. I'm just saying, let's go there. And then let's have our brand be recognized. And the last thing I'll just say now, I was doing a bit of research. So what are the most trusted brands in the world? This I found quite interesting. The most trusted 10 brands in the world last year, I'm not going to go through all of them. The first one is Band-Aid from Johnson & Johnson. The second one is Toyota, right? The number 8, guess what it is? It's Tim Hortons, globally. I couldn't believe, I actually went back on the screen, I said, "Is this a Canada thing, or what the hell is going?" It's Tim Hortons is in that. So, and it's interesting because in China, with all of the issues that were going on, Tim Hortons was just blowing out the stores like you wouldn't believe. And you'd go into the store, and it was people in lumberjack shirts. The door handles were hockey sticks. It was almost so much. I felt like I was in a, what was that show? The 2, guys on the front of this. That's what I thought it looked like. But that brand, when you have a brand like that actually helps secure us as well, because the consumers want it. And the last thing I just say on it, all during the difficult times in what we're having really rough times in China, there were people lined up outside the Canada Goose stores. They weren't being cut off because people wanted that. Because of the brand. And we talk about it, but we don't go after it. And I think it's doable. And if New Zealand can do that in a pretty short order, it's happened in the last 7 years, I think we can.
I like that story about marketing, and I think it connects back to what Chris Forbes was saying earlier today about, yes, we do have a strong regulatory system, but we are not going to sell it, if we don't bring the people on board. So we're telling our story to those who we sell products to.
But I think, Claire, what was really interesting when Ted sort of spoke this morning was the talk about trade promotion, and absolutely, but what Dominic's story is super important to highlight is the consumer and the role of the consumer. So going back to what is it that Canada's exporting, if again it's all commodities and it's going into traders, well, that doesn't give an opportunity to actually bring consumer sentiment to the buying table. And I think that's a real call to action for Canada in terms of processing and value add, because our commodities are not going to get us to the point that we want to actually access the B2C market. So maybe B2B we can do, but then we don't have the brand. Like it doesn't help with
the other part you just triggered, on this, is that maybe another dimension, I very much like, there was ambition, diversification. That doesn't mean, by the way, we have to do it all in Canada. So we, yes, our potential from within Canada is huge, and we should make sure we go after that. But because of that, because of our research, if I think about the capability of our ag science in Canada, it's astonishing. I think it's superb. There are a lot of countries in Africa that are going to go into agriculture. It's going to happen. Tanzania is going to start selling soybeans to China in a big way. Guess who they want to partner with? Canada. They'll own 70%. We take 30%. Why wouldn't we be thinking about these areas of the world as well, where the Canadian capability comes in, and then you're much of you're an insider. And that's one best practice example to me was actually McCain's on the potato side. They're building plants inside China, so they make I don't know what they call themselves or whatever, but and they're in the system, right? And so again, I think we have to think more creatively about, as this huge demand, and David McGuinness, 70% increase in food by 2050, we won't be able to produce it all. It's going to happen more in Africa and other places. What role could we play to be able to participate in that? Because we actually do have a research, like a quality brand on that side. It may not be on the consumer side.
So Canada's fastest growing exports are services. Just to give you a sense, so lots of that intelligence in many of our different sectors going, and what comes with that is then the equipment that follows that. So you end up with service providers that are used to particular equipment that then brings our equipment providers to the market, who are then used to particular types of ingredients or raw materials. So it's self-fulfilling. It actually generates even more exports when you get the service industry who's used to some particular partners to partner with.
So let me build on this. And if you look at the global context, global agri-food trade has tripled in the last 20 years, and we do have in Canada 15 free trade agreements with large nations and blocs around the world. We do also have the World Trade Organization and a system to trade with countries with which we don't have free trade agreements with. The level of risk has increased in recent years, and we experience major policy shifts around the world. People increasingly want to know how their food products are grown, raised, and transformed. So that creates a myriad of regulatory challenges, adding to the level of uncertainty for businesses. when we look at risk, what is your message to businesses as they look at opportunities around the world? Can you tell us about, first for Canada, what are the risks if we don't have the ambition, the infrastructure, the marketing? And then for companies, and perhaps Mairead, you can speak to that a bit more given your role with EDC. How do we de-risk international trade and ensure that we have the systems in place for exporters to conduct viable business? Because ultimately, businesses will do the trade if it makes sense commercially, from a commercial perspective.
You want me to kick off?
Yeah.
Alrighty, so that's a really big, long question there, Claire. I think there was more than one part to that question. So I'm going to go back to something Goldie said, so he gets the shout out from the podium. Businesses will do what businesses will do, and you have to go back to the fundamentals of supply and demand. So we know the demand is there. Everything tells us that the demand is there, and for Canadian ag, in whatever form that it necessarily is. So the questions then become, how do we ensure that the supply gets to market, gets to the right markets? And to your point, that's seizing the opportunity, but also how do we de-risk it? So when I think about this, I definitely think at it from a couple of different angles. When people talk to me about risk, I say it's one side of a coin, the other side is opportunity. So as much as we have to mitigate the risk, we also have to be able to seize the opportunity. When you go into risk mitigation, I think there's many, many different ways that the risk can be mitigated. You mentioned free trade agreements. They provide rules of law. They actually help with tariff barriers. They may not necessarily deal with all the tariff barriers because some of them are not necessarily as obvious, but it really starts to establish the rules of trade, which is very helpful. Then you start to see our government, our ambassadors, our former ambassadors, and actually the importance that the government has on G2G relations to actually be able to trade with countries. So you start to build it at different levels. At the company level, I often talk to them that exporting is not for the faint of heart. It means it's a step change in businesses usually. It's not an incremental change. So they have to be financially strong. More particularly, they have to have a management team that they can actually put on an export plan, that they can actually think about what their business model is, whether they want to partner, whether they want to have a distributor, whether they want to actually be in market. So it just comes to some of the basics of good business practices. And then for us at EDC, it's how can we actually help? How can we help finance that expansion? How can we bring all of our market intelligence to those companies to help them identify which market is going to work, who are the partners that can help them in the market, and at the very end of that, how can we actually ensure that they will get paid for when they go to these markets? So it's a many-faceted experience, one that has huge gains and one that needs to be very thoughtful as you go into it. So I think everybody has to play in this playing field. The demand is there. Our domestic market will not support our Canadian companies. That's why, as much as it's an opportunity, it's actually an imperative today. Today we look at the Canadian consumer, we see the high inflation, we certainly see high interest rates, notwithstanding the amount of pent-up demand that we felt would be coming out due to stimulus packages. I think there's a different sentiment today. So if our companies don't embrace this exporting, then they're actually dealing with a reducing domestic market at home. So it becomes an imperative to actually see how they can take on these risks and opportunities.
Thank you. Is there a risk that Canada can lose market share given the talk about reshoring and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Goldie said, there's blocks that are emerging, and I believe globalization is going to continue. I just don't buy that it's going away. I think but it's going to be different, and there will be more integrated flows, and I think it's important to make sure we're in those. There's not, I think, going to be many, maybe 5 or 6, but we should think about being in those flows. So one is the diversification. We also, I very much just want to anchor something you said at the beginning, like, don't tell business where to go. What used to drive me crazy on the China, people said, we got to tell business to be careful about being in China. What? No, we're not going to say that, because you need 10 Vietnams to even get so let's be careful what we tell people. What we need to do is tell people about the risk. If you do that, you need to be prepared for this as you go through it. And then, so I think, let's think about the diversification. Let's get people to move that way. I remember Michael Sabia did some very good analysis in the Growth Council, which showed that our SMEs are in the OECD in the bottom rankings in terms of being globally minded. We just don't, and I'm not even talking about the US, I'm just talking that that's pretty surprising, right? So what is it we can do to encourage those companies? New Zealand, by the way, had a similar problem, and so did Malaysia. And that's where there's been a program, industry and government, to try and encourage people to go and to try it, but recognizing you need to have certain capabilities. So I think those are the elements. I think on the government side, what's critical is, if we're going to support our ag food, industry and agriculture in general, and we're in these markets, the government, the G to G that we've talked about, which is critical, that's too broad level of a thing. What we need to do is have a very good relationship with the head of customs in Nanjing for pork. That's who we have to have a relationship with. And we better know that for Vietnam and for Indonesia and for India. It's a level of granularity. We like to talk up here. It doesn't do anything. So I think our kind of supporting infrastructure on that side has also got to fit so that we can get a sense if something's going on, because I think a lot of this will happen not because we don't want to trade with you. It's like, we found some problems with your material. It's just, there's dockage. The dockage is higher. So that's why we're not taking any more. It's not, we're going to teach you. I think we're going to see more of that going on. And so you need to have people who are in those key places to be able to do it. And you have to have that relationship before the problem occurs. Because if you try and build it when it does occur, nothing's going to happen.
Can I just pick up on one of Dominic's point about globalization? I'm totally in support, Dominic. Globalization is not going to go away. Traditionally, when we hit periods of maybe economic instability or challenges, and certainly when the big R word comes on the table of recession, everybody picks at globalization. Everybody's like, it's going away. It hasn't gone away in the last 30 years. It's just grown. And I think if you look at our integrated supply chains today, which we haven't really mentioned, those are incredibly difficult to break up. I mean, they've been established over a long period of time. And will they change and perhaps morph a bit to, your discussion, Dominic, about 6 regional areas where people might trade intra-region more than they did in the past? The answer to that is probably yes. But it still means we can see Canadian companies that are present in those regions actually doing trade within those regions. So that's still a global Canadian company, even if they end up trading regionally, which I think the other term or word or acronym that we haven't used yet in this conversation is ESG. And ESG will drive more regional trading patterns, if only because people will want to reduce their emissions. They will have to understand the human rights implications of what is in their supply chain, and they will have to be closer to the businesses to understand who they can actually trade with. All of that demands a closer understanding of their trading relationships, and that might force more regional trading, but it's still a global trading network that's going to exist.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions from the floor. And please introduce yourself first.
Hi, Pierre Patel, CropLife Canada. Dominic, we sat on a panel 6 years ago talking about your report, and one of the things we unpacked a little bit then was regulatory environment and how that can either impede or accelerate some of these growth targets you had. I can say with confidence that since that panel, things have gotten worse on the regulatory side, certainly for plant
I'm not
sciences.
laughing at that, just, I don't.
And there are examples of Canadian companies moving their business and growth targets to the US and Australia. What is this is the million-dollar question, but what is it going to take to get this government to sort of view agriculture and actually set regulatory policies that will enable that investment and innovation that we need to get the growth targets that you outlined many years ago?
Yeah, it's a great point. Certainly, we don't need any more words or recommendations on it. I think it's execution, which is one of the biggest challenges we have. And I do remember that on the regulatory side. And I remember Mairead Al-Khatib, that's front and center in that sector table piece as well, just how long it takes. So I think there should be a standard, like speed actually is a measure that we're actually going to have on the stuff, because it costs business, it costs money. We're talking in other resource sectors how long it takes to get a permit, right, to be able to do things. That has a very significant economic cost. So I think we should it's that kind of like red tape review, and let's get some standards that are set and compare them to other countries. And I do remember in that report, there were some areas, and I know these are totally different countries, where Rwanda was doing it 100 times faster. Now I know you could say, well, what's their quality? Well, actually, it was pretty good quality in terms of how they did it, but there was a mindset of speed. So I think we have to break it down. It's a bit like break it down and put targets on it, because I've heard similar stories to what you're saying.
CJ Noble from the National Cattle Feeders Association. Dominic, we've talked about barriers of transportation infrastructure, but we haven't touched on the chronic labor shortages on farm, in processing, and now really in trucking. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on how we overcome that to actually harness our export opportunities.
Yeah, I think one of the things we had identified in that work was the labor shortage before too, right? And part of that, I think, was to try and, looking at immigration. I'm just I remember this, I haven't thought about it on the transportation side, but if you think about mushrooms, which actually it's a very good business. It isn't as bad as it seems if you're a mushroom picker. I'm just trying, but it's a well-paid job. There's lots of opportunities. And so I actually think on this, what we need to do is size it and say, this is the gap that we actually have and where it is, making people more aware of where that is. And then where are we actually are we going to find them within Canada, or are we going to find them overseas? I'll just say one thing. It's so interesting. I'm spending a lot of time in Australia right now, and Australia's they used to have quite an open system for having people come in, and then it's become quite closed, and they're suffering big time because they're so short of labor, and you're seeing shifts that are going on to try and attract talent. They're actually looking overseas now to try and build it in. So that's not a very specific answer, but I think we have to, let's size it so we know what that gap is, and then let's look for, even if we have to, outside. I don't know if there's a compensation. I have no idea what how attractive it is, because many times too, when we talk about a category, people have a mindset of, I don't want to do that, when actually it's actually more interesting than what people might think it is.
Can I jump in on that? Maybe to add two more thoughts. I add automation into this. Like, I think we've got to fundamentally shift our thinking that labor will provide the answer to all the shortages that we have today. Part of the issue, and I hear this from exporters all the time, I would say up until about 3-4 months ago, labor was their number one issue for actually meeting the demand. Now it's interest rates, no surprise that that's moved to the top of the list. But if we don't start to automate many of our industries, and we're talking basic automation, we're not, we're not talking about the robots that can actually talk back to us or anything, but there's so much that we can actually be doing on the automation front and in this sector and in this industry. So I certainly look to some of the farming practices that will have to change. And then the second thing is we also have a very fixed mindset about what exporting looks like. And I want to challenge that. So we've talked about service exporting today as a different type of exporting, but we support companies that actually set up facilities, put inventory in other countries, that they actually leverage the economic activity in growing countries around the world to supply their customers wherever they might be based. So because we believe fundamentally that if we can get a Canadian company to grow, and of course we would love to see them grow within Canada, but they may not always be able to meet the demand. And I can't remember, there was a discussion this morning about Japan and supplying the whole Japanese market versus the Tokyo market. So thank you for that, Ted, this morning, that example. But that's what you see that exporters have to deal with. They actually can't incrementally just change the amount of product they put out. It's a step change. And therefore that step change cannot always be provided from Canada. And we have to think of very different business models that allow Canadian companies to access that opportunity, but perhaps using different resources and a mix of resources to do that. So we call it Canadian direct investment abroad, and we'd love to see more of it because that augments the Canadian brand, and that does a lot more for the consumer in country where you're giving to their country's economic development as well. David?
Hi, everyone. I'd like to pick up on the issue of brand. My name is David McGuinness, and I represent a coalition of 120 private-public partners advancing Canada's first agri-food sustainability index called the National Index on Agri-Food Performance. And in fact, it's in response to an idea that you and the council initiated some years ago, which was to advance Canada's trusted, most sustainable food brand. While 120 partners, a number of whom are here today, have grabbed that, and we're framing it up. How do we measure sustainability? And if we do it in a broad way, environmental, food safety, societal well-being, economic, how do we leverage that in the domestic and the global marketplace? And so we're working through a program to do this. I should add that while New Zealand, Australia, the Americans are now starting to wheel in, some folks in Europe, they're doing this to some degree. Ireland is actually furthest ahead, but Canada is stepping up. And in fact, we're going way beyond what these other countries are doing. So it's a competitive opportunity. But my question is about when we do frame this up and create the metrics to demonstrate sustainability, how do we strategically leverage this, such as in global standards development? How can we punch above our weight and have an influence on how these standards work around the world, or in terms of influencing ESG policy? And I think that if we get the terms of trade working in our favor and we're able to promote what stands behind the brand, maybe that's a 1-2 punch that might have a little more weight.
Brief
Thanks for your comments.
answers if we can, and then we're going to take one more final question after this.
Fully agree. I mean, I think that what you said makes a ton of sense. I think we need to be more specific about what those are on health, sustainability, and so forth. And I think the regulatory side has to fit it. Are we doing it? Do we do it quickly and efficiently? But I think that's a distinctive area to lead in.
I think David, my advice is we've got to be really honest about our sustainability indices and what we put into it and indicate where we're good and where we're bad. Because the last thing we want as Canada is to be accused of greenwashing in sustainability indices. I think we have lots of advantages in Canada that we can really put into an index to say, I mean, it starts with just our inputs in Canada and the electricity that we use to convert anything that we have, and it goes right through the supply chain. But we have to be clear and honest, because other than that, we won't establish any credibility as a country. We're also lucky to have lots of institutions being based here in Canada, including the International Sustainability Standards Board, which I think will help Canada actually recognize that, you know, it's here, one of its offices here in Frankfurt, and that equally we should be using that as an advantage.
Last one, briefly.
Thank you. Again, Luc Diesel with the University of Ottawa. So I really like what was said about building a national brand. However, when you think of Canada internationally, it's hard not to think also of our neighbors to the south. So do you think that one of the first steps that we need to take to build a distinctive Canadian brand is to differentiate ourselves from the American image as far as product diversity goes, sustainability or quality?
Yeah, I think I actually would just more focus on ourselves versus the Americans. I just think we don't have it right now. So let's just get one before we even start moving there. You know, New Zealand has it and so forth. And I think the part that I feel, I'm not a brand, developer, is around this notion of it's very high quality, the highest quality in the world. It's healthy. It's regulated very well. You can trust it. You know what I mean? It's really good. It's the high end, if you will. And the Americans have that too. I think then it gets down into the product. I mean, why is Tim Hortons? I'm again shocked by that, right? Why are they? That's more than Starbucks, by the way. You know what I'm saying? So what have they done to try and I think you get into the particular products, it'll be different. I just think again what we need to do is just make sure for that consumer group that you're going after, that's the key. We have to have a way deeper understanding of that consumer group. What is our value proposition versus competitors, which is Americans, maybe Germans, Italians, and that's how I would kind of try and look at it, as opposed to just saying it's a good point, but let's opposed to saying let's be Canada versus US. It's focus on the consumer, who's the competitor in that area, and then how do we differentiate ourselves?
Yeah, and I think we do the consumer a misjustice when we assume that they can't make that distinction. I don't think that's the case. I think consumers actually, with social media, et cetera, can make the distinction between the US and Canada. What we need to focus on is competitiveness of Canada versus the US, because at the end of the day, the consumer can make that choice. But if the Canadian product is 2x times the price or 3x times the price of a US product, well, then it's going to be a different question for the consumer. So I wouldn't mix brand with competitiveness.
Thank you on this, and we're getting the signal to wrap up.
You are.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking the panel. As well as the Canadian Canola Growers Association for supporting the discussion. Give us 3 minutes for the next session. Just take your lanyard off, Ambassador, so it doesn't rub.